In his new novel, Disnaeland, DD Johnston tells the story of a working-class Scottish community in the midst of a global blackout. Faced with a harsh winter and total societal collapse, residents have the choice of either turning on each other in a war of all against all, or coming together on the basis of mutual aid and cooperation to build a new world from the ruins of the old. This is working-class literature.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao alla mattina.
Before we start, a quick note to say that we're only able to continue making these podcasts, both working class history and literature, because of the support of our listeners on Patreon. If you like what we do and want to help us with our work, join us on patreon.com/workingclasshistory, where you can get benefits like early access to episodes, exclusive bonus content, discounted books, merch, and more. Link in the show notes. This is the first part of a double episode with an author that we've been big fans of for a while. DD Johnston's new novel, Disnaeland, is a blackly comic tale of proletarian apocalypse, but he's also going to speak to us about some of his other works, as well as his life, political activism, and thoughts on working class writing more generally. With regards to working class writing, Darren brings up a number of issues, not just in relation to how we think about what working class writing is, but also what we want it to do, and even the different ways that we think about and experience class itself.
Well, I think the term working class it's a funny one, isn't it? Because it means different things in different contexts, and in common usage in the UK, certainly, it tends to be associated with people and families that derive their income for manual or unskilled work. And because of, I guess, changes to the sort of labour that capitalism requires, increasingly working class refers to a disadvantaged minority in our society in terms of popular usage. Now, at the same time, working class also refers to the same, what Marxists would call the proletariat, that great majority of people that have got no way to access society's resources except through selling their labour power. So I'm proletarian, if I'm going to pay my house, my food, the ever rising fuel costs and what have you, I've got to sell my labour power. I done various jobs in food, like I worked at a pizza place. I worked for Burger King for 1 month and they fired me. Then I worked for McDonald's for quite a few years. I worked in a coach station, and I worked as a bouncer a couple of times, which is weird. This is going out. You can't see me on this, but I'm a scrawny wee guy. So various jobs like that. And then I ended up doing a PhD and getting a gig teaching writing. But I'm also middle class. I work at a university, and there's all sorts of people who maybe fit into one definition of working class, but no the other. There's people who'd fit into the idea of working class in that they're maybe low wage, maybe working unskilled, but they're not proletarian. They might be, self-employed, running their own wee business, etc. I should say, when I say that I'm middle class, I should be clear that I don't have very much money just now. I need the money. Buy my book. That's the takeaway. Disneyland. I need the money, but that's mainly because I mainly look after my wee boy. I don't do very much paid work just now. But cultural capital, oozing out my pores. I've got. I enjoy contemporary theatre. I like watch Michael Haneke films. So that's a complication, I guess, with just the general population. And then when it comes to thinking about what makes a working class writer, there's other things going on, because first of all, you got the whole question of representation. Who gets a chance to tell their stories? I think there's important stuff about where a writer's coming from and where they want us to go, what they want their work to do. And in terms of where a writer's coming from, the baggage that they bring with them as a writer, their life experience, that's really relevant. And that's often related to class. The stuff that I write about, I've I've seen a disproportionate amount of violence in my life. I think I've got one of those faces that people just can't help scalping. They're just really annoying. So when I was younger, I got hospitalised way more often than I should have done, and beaten up lots and stabbed and near set on fire and all this sort of stuff. And that comes out in the work. I write a lot about violence. I write a lot about addiction. I also write a lot about love, and these themes that come out of our life experiences are relevant, and that can be a lot to do with class. And then there's a question of what a writer wants their work to do. What's their ambition with it? And again, the two aren't necessarily aligned. Where a writer's coming from, and certainly not in class terms. Simply, I often think, like, if you had to choose, choose one, right, as a example of a working class writer, who are you going to go for? D.H. Lawrence or, I don't know, George Orwell, say. D.H. Lawrence is a son of an illiterate miner, but certainly in his younger days, he didn't think that working class folks should even vote. George Orwell went to Eton. But what did they want their writing to do? And Sartre talked about the committed writer, and that seems to me relevant as well when we're thinking about what it means to be a working class writer, and whose interests are we working towards. And I write fiction from the same place of anger and optimism that I used to write graffiti. And I suppose that's why ultimately I'd probably choose Orwell or John Berger or Ursula Le Guin or someone like that as a working class writer, maybe over a D.H. Lawrence.
Indeed, while D.H. Lawrence was an incredible writer and hugely important for other working class writers in the 20th century, his work is often filled with the kind of disjuncture Darren talks about between an author's background and their content. For instance, in Sons and Lovers, the main character Paul is filled with bitterness towards his coal miner father, who basically ruins the life of his middle-class wife by marrying her. And even in Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is a scathing critique of industrial capitalism, he describes the conflict between coal miners and employers as a wage squabble, with both miners and bosses equally taking part in, quote, triumphing or being trodden down in the rush of mechanised greed, end quote. In contrast, Darren mentions some middle-class authors who can be thought to fulfill the idea of Marxist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre about the committed writer, in that they explicitly put their writing in the service of the workers' movement. George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, for instance, is an account of his experiences during the revolutionary upheaval of the Spanish Civil War. Ursula Le Guin's sci-fi novels frequently imagine the possibilities of alternative utopian societies. And when John Berger's experimental novel of transnational rebellion, G, won the Booker Prize, he used the opportunity to denounce Booker's exploitation of the Caribbean and donated half the prize money to the London Black Panthers. In contrast to Lawrence, then, the theme underlying these writers' works, despite their backgrounds, is that working class people can organise society themselves for their own benefit. That being said, the publishing industry is still one riddled with inequality and dominated by the middle and upper classes, with the effect that working class writers are frequently locked out.
If you go to meet a literary agent or something, it's not going to be over a couple of Carlsberg and a local Spooner, it's going to be skinny lattes at somewhere that does great vegan patisseries, and you talk about your yoga classes. I've got many sort of deficiencies and failings as a human being, and I couldn't necessarily pin them on a particular demographic. With regards to the elitism of the publishing industry, it's a question of there's been a lot of attention in terms of looking at the gender and race balance of prize lists, and that's changed a huge deal in 40 years. Class is probably a bit slower to change. Do you know the lists of best young writers under 40 that Grant had done it? So they did one 1983, 93, 2003, 2013, and I'm guessing they're going to do one next year. So those lists are hugely influential in terms of shaping who gets critical attention within each generation. And at least once they've included a writer, Monica Ali, who at the time had never published anything. So they're very influential things. And I think there've been in total 75 people have appeared on those lists, because some people have been on them more than once. And only 2 of them never went to university. And maybe even more striking than that, is that 14 of them attended University of London colleges, 16 attended Cambridge and 22 Oxford. So well over 2/3 of all these people went to just 3 institutions. And that's a striking demonstration of how our literary culture continues to be built around a wee elite.
Despite this culture of elitism in publishing, Scotland has an extremely rich history of writing by and about the working class, which was hugely influential on Darren when he was getting interested in literature.
I get into writing. I suppose for one thing that I was probably lucky that in Scotland there's a lot of role models, a lot of writers that I looked up. Like I read when I was at school, we had to do a book review and we got to go into the school library and choose a book. And sort of at random, I picked out a collection of William McIlvanney stories. And that really, that really sort of, it blew me away. Like I'd not read anything like that. And you've got this tradition of Scottish, and for me as a young man, and particularly identifying with male writers probably, but guys like William McIlvanney, Jim Kelman, Alistair Gray, later Irvine Welsh. I mean, Irvine Welsh, like, I think it's, fair play to guys, like Trainspotting was read widely, certainly around Edinburgh, in a way that very few books are. A lot of people read that book. So I had that sort of influence, but then what really happened was I was living in France, and my girlfriend she left me for the branch secretary of the local anarcho-syndicalist trade union. I should say that she had very good reasons for doing this, and I'm almost, it's sort of, I'll say like 20 years now. I'm almost over it, In fact, she's coming to visit me later this month with her family, and it'll be very nice to see her. So I'm not bitter, but at the time, gutted. And I realised that the only way that I could sort of heal was to write these awful, melancholic sort of love laments, like this a sort of anti-capitalist Scottish Sorrows of Young Werther or something like that. But as I sort of began to get myself together, I started to think, all right, well, what can I actually do with this? And it seemed that to me that writing fiction was a sort of a fuller way to explore life than maybe just writing sort of political theory or whatever.
So aside from Irvine Welsh, who became world famous because of Trainspotting, Darren mentions a few writers here who people might not be familiar with. William McIlvanney, for instance, was a multi-award-winning novelist and son of a miner who wrote the Laidlaw detective novels, and his works often see troubled characters in conflict with themselves and their surroundings. Alistair Gray, whose novel Lanark is considered a classic of Scottish writing, was the son of a warehouse worker and builder's labourer from Glasgow, while Jim Kelman, another Glaswegian, is known for his aesthetically innovative novels such as How Late It Was, How Late, which won the 1994 Booker Prize and upset a lot of middle-class critics as a result. Darren also mentions writing anti-capitalist love laments in the style of The Sorrows of a Young Werther, which is an 18th century novel by German writer Johann Goethe about a young man's response to heartbreak. The radical politics of Darren's novels come from his own experiences as an activist. One group he was involved in was McDonald's Workers' Resistance, a rebellious collective of McDonald's workers, which in the early days of the internet managed to spread around the UK and internationally, leading to interviews in popular magazines like Face and Loaded, and an international McStrike in 2002. We go into more detail about MWR and our bonus content for this episode, available exclusively for our supporters on Patreon. At first, however, things at McDonald's started far more locally for Darren and his workmates.
There were particular things that were happening at our restaurant, at where we worked. And often there's wee things that are antagonisms in a workplace. It was the sort of things like with a system where sometimes you'd have to stay all through the night and clean up the store and polish everything, like if somebody from the head office was going to come and visit and what have you. And the managers would say, well, I want you to work all through the night, but I'll give you a £10 bonus in your wages. And you go, all right, fair enough. And you'd do it. And then you'd never get the bonus. So that was really annoying folk. And then one day, I think a version of this is in my first novel. One day, this customer died. He was just, queuing for his burger, and I think he had a heart attack. And it was a sort of bizarre spectacle because for a while, like nobody really knew what to do. So people were still selling burgers. All the customers were sort of stepping around this guy while they were trying to resuscitate him, and it went on for quite a while. Eventually, the ambulance came, tried to revive him, couldn't do it, and he died. So they closed the restaurant while they took the body out, and we all went outside. We're all having a smoke and just thinking about what happened. And we're talking about workers who are 16, 17, 18, haven't probably seen somebody die before, and everyone was a wee bit shook up. And we decided we were going to go across the road to the pub. After a wee while, manager comes across the road and says, we're reopening the restaurant. And we all said, no, we're not coming back. And they couldn't really do anything because we'd all gone. And they just waited till the night shift came in and they reopened. But it was a wee thing. And then we got talking and we started to say, well, what about starting a trade union? Because that's what you think, first of all. So we went round and we collected all the signatures to join a trade union. And I think we got 40 signatures out of the 60 folk that worked there. But actually, it takes a long time to work out what to do with them and how to apply, and you've got to go through all this legal process. And of course, by the time we started to do that, the staff turnover is so high that there was hardly sort of that they would suddenly not got the majority anymore. So we started doing something different instead, and we started doing it secretly and having a wee bit of a laugh with it.
Because of this, McDonald's workers' resistance was very different from traditional union campaigns. MWR never tried to present themselves as hard-working staff members, and humour was always a big part of everything they did, from prank calling Richard Branson to writing fan fiction about Ronald McDonald making balloon phalluses at children's birthday parties.
I think for one thing, we had no sort of we were openly antagonistic to the company. Most unions, even when they're on strike, they have to say, this is going to build a better service, or it's going to, make this company stronger in the long run. And we were quite explicit that we sort of hated McDonald's, and we knew we had to do it anonymously because if we didn't, we were just going to get sacked straight away. Just get they just come in the next day. They just said, right, you're out. So we knew we had to do it secretly, which made it really hard. It's really hard to. There's things you just can't do when you're trying to be anonymous, but it also really frees you up to say whatever you think and not worry about it. So we'd do, we'd all our material it was really pretty offensive looking back on it. But it was all very sort of confrontational, and I suppose it was in a cultural moment. We were. This was the late 90s. It was just after grunge culture, and we were saying, we had writing guides on how to slack off and telling people, it was we'd be always doing we'd be taking company propaganda and changing words to do funny things with it and that, and messing around with text and images. And of course, it was this postmodernism was in the cultural sphere at the time, and we were all watching Tarantino films, and so sort of that sort of messing around with text sort of came to us pretty naturally. It was a time of new lad culture, and we were writing obscene jokes about Ronald McDonald and doing prank phone calls and all this sort of thing. And the other thing I think, looking back on it, is I didn't really think this at the time, but it strikes me that for young men, and it was it was a mainly male workforce, young men in Scotland at that time, it was a pretty macho culture, and you were sort of expected to stand up for yourself. If somebody was looking at you funny, then you were sort of meant to, give them the square goals or whatever, even if they were much bigger than you. And here we had this huge, big company relentlessly taking the piss out of us. So it was sort of really natural to stand up to them. I mean, we gained very little, especially in the once we sort of broadened it out. We tried to have quite near the end, we tried to do a sort of campaign for to increase the wage, and I never really got going. I mean, I'd say we gained a lot in dignity for ourselves. It was certainly in the early days, we just do. I mean, at a little local level, we could just do things like the way that the kitchen worked in McDonald's, or at least did then. You'd have somebody who was in charge of what they called wrap and call, and they'd like sort of be shouting, like, "Go on, I need 4 fish. Come on, hustle, hustle, hustle!" And they were sort of the boss of the kitchen. So we just sort of apply direct democracy and say that they could be a instantly recallable delegate and things like that. And most of the time, it would carry on pretty much as usual. But there was the sense of fun to it all was really important. Certainly looking back.
Darren's involvement in McDonald's workers' resistance led him into the broader anti-capitalist movement.
Well, I got involved in that through the McDonald's stuff, in that I went looking for help for the McDonald's stuff to a place called the Autonomous Centre of Edinburgh. And if anybody is listening and has lots of money going spare, then Autonomous Centre of Edinburgh would definitely appreciate your donations just now. It's like many social spaces, it's struggling to survive and it's out of its current premises. And they've been running a long time, since the mid-90s, and before that was the Unemployed Workers Centre in Edinburgh. So that was a very important place for me. I went in there looking for help, and they gave a lot of practical support to McDonald's stuff, things like connecting us with there's a history in Scotland, certainly, of anarchist printers, which I suppose makes sense because before the internet, that's how you got your stuff out. So they'd print on magazines and stickers and all of that. Or like with the first email that I ever sent was to the McLibel defendants, Dave Morris and Helen Steele. And I went into this place, Autonomous Centre of Edinburgh, and said that I need to send an email. And a guy there said, "Well, our computer isn't working just now, but there's a feminist comrade down in Leith. She's got a computer, and I'll phone her up." And I got 2 buses down there, went all the way down there, met her, went and I sent this email. That's how things have changed, but that was the first email I ever sent. And then through hanging around that space, I started meeting all the weird punks and crusties and all the rest of it. And really fell in love with the movement. And I loved the way that I'd be trusted to do things, even though I was new. People say, "Well, do you want to write this?" I know how to do it. And you're just really encouraged. And so through that, we did a lot of community campaigns, like local strikes, local neighbourhood struggles against developments and what have you. I did some anti-fascist stuff, which maybe meant something a wee bit different then. And of course, the anti-capitalist movement was in full swing, and there were these huge protests at leaders' summits at the G8 and the WTO and the World Bank and all this. And there was always this frustration that energy of these big protests didn't translate more into grassroots struggles in communities and workplaces. But looking back, it's pretty amazing the scale and the militancy of these protests, and the fact that it became impossible for governments to meet in cities. It's an amazing thing, they had to go off and hide in places like Glen Eagles because they couldn't safely meet in their cities, and that's pretty amazing.
These experiences make up a lot of Darren's first novel, Peace, Love and Petrol Bombs, which, as far as I know anyway, is the only work of fiction to be set around the action of the anti-globalisation movement.
So I think like a lot of first novels, it's pretty autobiographical. It's about a young guy that is working flipping burgers, and he and his pals start a sort of resistance movement, and then he gets mixed up with the anti-capitalist movement, and then he gets dumped by his French girlfriend.
Peace, Love and Petrol Bombs is also a novel that engages with older forms of working class writing, not just in ways that draw out parallels between past and present working class life and struggle, but also the ways they've changed. Darren is about to read a passage that overtly pays homage to Robert Tressel's classic socialist novel, The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, specifically referencing Tressel's famous Great Money Trick. But in Darren's novel, the money trick is reworked and updated to connect it to the present day.
Want to hear Spocky's explanation of capitalism? Of course you don't. Nobody wanted to hear Spocky's explanation of capitalism. Still, once he got talking, it was impossible to shut him up. In his money trick, he used chocolate flakes to represent the world's raw materials and a discarded tomato slicer to represent the technology that industry uses to turn those raw materials into commodities. Lucy and I were the global proletariat, and he was supposed to represent the entire capitalist class. As such, he owned all the raw materials and all the machinery used to turn those raw materials into commodities. Because Lucy and I were wage labourers, we needed jobs if we were to share in the wealth of the world. Spocky said he would pay me to work in his factory, and so, at his instruction, I put a chocolate flake between the blades of the tomato slicer and cut it into 5 chunks. Lucy also needed a job, and Spocky agreed to employ her in the accounts department of his office. Now, bear with us. I know the guy was no David Blaine. At Spocky's instruction, Lucy gave 10 pence to me and 12 pence to herself. Now, this is where it got tricky. Spocky agreed to sell us the chocolate for 12 pence a morsel, and when I complained that I only had 10 pence, he said I could buy the chocolate on my credit card. So, while Lucy and I each ate a morsel of chocolate, Spocky reclaimed his 22 pence, ate 2 morsels, and told us to chop another flake. Same thing happened. Lucy gave me 10 pence, she and I each ate a chunk of chocolate, and Spocky, after eating 2 chunks, reminded me that my debt was now 4 pence, plus 1 penny interest. And you can see where this is going. By the time we chopped another 5 flakes, Spocky, representing the entire capitalist class, had acquired a reserve of 7 morsels of chocolate. He also had all the money he'd started with and was owed an additional 32 pence that the global proletariat had incurred in debt. He then declared that Lucy and I were redundant since his warehouse was full and production had exceeded demand. However, since I was now unemployed and unable to meet the interest repayments on my debt, Spocky employed Lucy to repossess my flat. When I asked where I was supposed to live, he said he was prepared to let me my old flat for 5 pence a week. When I asked how I was supposed to afford rent, he said he'd employ me to build a new house for Lucy. When Lucy asked how she was supposed to pay for it, he said he'd lend her the money at a very reasonable rate. Soon, with each round of chocolate cutting, Lucy and I could only afford crumbs of the chunks we were producing. The truth is that Spocky's explanation of capitalism was like death. You could only avoid it for so long. He explained capitalism to everybody. Taxi drivers, hairdressers, outbound telesales agents. It got to the stage where the Jehovah's Witnesses were afraid to knock at our door. If Spocky caught them in the stair, they'd start making excuses why they couldn't stay and talk. Worst of all, he had an answer to everything. Okay, you would say, if you don't like being a wage labourer, why don't you start your own business? And this would only set him off again. Let us suppose, he'd say, that Lucy tires of working for wages and decides to open a wine bar. This is great news for Wayne, said Spocky, because in opening the wine bar, Lucy will be creating employment. However, Wayne will have to admit that he is in no position to help Lucy with the start-up costs. Now, let us suppose that after viewing her business proposal, the Bank of Scotland is prepared to lend Lucy sufficient funds to launch a brasserie. This is very good news for the economy, which was, frankly, in danger of stagnating. One problem, however, is that because of the interest charged on loans, the amount of money owed is greater than the amount of money in circulation. The global proletariat and the petty bourgeoisie now have combined debts of 52 pence, yet only 22 pence exists. And the only way to make new money without sparking hyperinflation is to encourage economic growth. In other words, according to Spocky, every year, globally and nationally, the economy has to grow. Otherwise, he said, businesses such as Lucy's Wine Bar will be unable to repay their investors, workers will be made redundant, and bankers will transfer funds to other economies. If some workers are made redundant, then all workers are affected. The unemployed workers have less money to spend, so more businesses go bust. People worry about losing their jobs, consumer confidence collapses, and the economy stagnates. No growth means poverty, recession, negative equity, plagues of locusts, etc. Meanwhile, a growing population means more people are competing for fewer jobs. No wonder everybody wants to see jobs created. It doesn't matter whether we need or want more jobs doing. All that matters is that we find new ways of making money out of each other. This is why so much money needs to be spent on advertising and telesales, so that we want to buy shit, which ultimately we're going to have to produce. So in the UK, despite all our technological advances, we're working longer hours today than 40 years ago. The paradox is that we're facing an ecological crisis caused by production levels that are already unsustainable. Globally and nationally, we're not short of resources. People starve while food they've produced is thrown away on the other side of the world. In Britain, people sleep on the streets while 800,000 homes sit empty. The planet can't sustain the indefinite production of more stuff, and we don't want to have to make it. Right now, According to Spocky, it's like we're on a runaway train and the guard is shouting at the stoker to work harder and harder. We can keep grafting until we hit the end of the line, or, with a collective leap of imagination, maybe we can jump off the train.
Darren's updated Great Money Trick plays with similarity and difference from Tressel's original in ways that make us think about the similarities and differences in working class experience between then and now. And despite the passage poking fun at Spocky, ultimately, by the end, we still want to take part in that collective leap of imagination. There's also a playfulness in the passage, not least in its contrast between the two workers cutting up chocolate flakes with a tomato slicer and the entire global proletariat that they're supposed to represent. This kind of comic juxtaposition is something Darren uses a lot in his writing, but rather than being a way of mocking grand ideas about changing the world, for Darren, it's a central part of it.
First of all, I'm always struck by how comic being sort of in a revolutionary movement is, because there is this absurd juxtaposition. Like if you're in a sort of grassroots organising, that on the one hand, you're talking about something absolutely enormous, like the total abolition of wage labour and the construction of a classless society and a revolutionary utopia. And then the next item on the agenda will be, so Dave didn't order the gas canister, so we do need to replace that. Like these tiny little things. And it can seem utterly ridiculous, like, and that sort of absurdity crops up like in so many ways. Like I remember me and another guy that was in McDonald's Workers' Resistance, we went to a No Borders camp in Strasbourg, where it must be 2001, 2002, something like that. And we were camping on the banks of the river that separates France and Germany. Is that the Rhine? I'm not sure. And demanding the end to Fortress Europe, free movement for all human beings, total, opening of all borders, quite a radical change. But then we start marching into the centre of Strasbourg, leaving the camp, and we're met by an enormous crowd of riot police, like hundreds of them. And the French riot police have got that sort of, they're quite open about the fact that they're there for a fight, and the French riot police, they said that we had two options. Either we returned to the camp immediately and stayed there and did not leave, or they would beat us all severely and throw us in jail. So we started walking back towards the camp, but then we get to this bridge over to Germany. And someone thinks, well, why don't we just go over the bridge? And of course, the French riot police, they stop at their side of the bridge. They don't want to create a major diplomat. They're going to restart the Franco-Prussian War or something, invade Germany. So on the other side of the bridge, there's two local German bobbies. But we hadn't learned any chants in German. We'd got our French chants. Paris partout, justice nous pas, solidarité avec les sans-papiers. But German chants. We're walking around this wee little German town, and some German autonomen, they start chanting, "Kein Mensch ist illegal," powerful slogan. Nobody is illegal, but we didn't hear it right. And for the next hour, we were going around this wee town going, "Klein Mensch ist illegal." Small people are illegal. Small people. All these Germans looking at how they pronounce, and it's just so, it's so absurd. But that is like the reason why I say it's an essential feature of revolutionary politics is that everything was on a big scale. If everything was serious and properly organised, then that would tend towards centralisation and despotism. And if everything was only at a local scale, if it didn't have these grand ambitions, then that would tend towards, NIMBYism, and it would have a lack of ambition about actually changing things. So it's necessarily the case, I think, that a revolution would be a macro event that's made up of all these tiny little things. It's made up of the folk that forgot to order a gas canister and the protesters that couldn't get the words to the chant right and all the rest. And yet all these little wee acts, though they may seem silly and insignificant in themselves, millions, billions of them add up to a total transformation of society.
This idea of macro events being made up of an uncountable number of micro events runs through Darren's first 2 novels. So in Peace, Love and Petrol Bombs, you get big anti-capitalist protests in various major European cities, but also the lives and struggles of a small group of young workers at a fast food restaurant in the fictional Scottish town of Dundee. Similarly, Darren's second novel, The Deconstruction of Professor Thrubb, follows a Belfast woman's journey of love and political awakening as it intersects with working class rebellion from the Battle of Cable Street to the Spanish Civil War and the 1956 Hungarian uprising, all told through the PhD thesis of a graduate student whose disaffected professor is trying to avoid him. Disneyland, however, moves away from that kind of broad international and historical sweep. In this novel, Darren returns to the Dundee of his first novel to focus on a single working class community and how it deals with a power cut during a freezing Scottish winter. In the passage that Darren is about to read, a small group of residents decide to hole up in a flat together, for warmth and for safety from the events outside as society begins to crumble.
Long story short, that evening, Giorgio padlocks shut the Lord of the Fries, then he struggles up the stair with his mattress, his blanket, and Marjorie. He's surprised Marjorie can manage the stair. He carries a walking frame and she shuffles sideways, gripping the banister with both hands. Then Giorgio goes back down to shoulder up the pish-scented mattress, which bends and dips like a giant fish. But though he never slept the night before, though it's warm, relatively speaking like, and though he's tired as hell, Giorgio can't sleep. It gets dark so early, and yet it's strangely bright, Ken. The skies have cleared, and the moonlight's reflected by the snow. For the first hours after the sun goes down, he's disturbed by Tam and Mac's bullhorn whispers, their snorts and neighs and whinnies. But even when they at last pass out, he lies awake, listening to them all snoring. Ruth makes a noise like a deflating bike tyre. Donna sounds like a hospital respirator, and Douglas spits words in his sleep. Bastard, bugger, cancer, death. Then Giorgio sees by the moonlight that wee Ava's awake and all. She's lying next to her ma, looking at him, and he's struck by how terrifying all this must be for her. And right then he's pure raging at her ma, at Donna, because that wee lassie deserves better than lying awake alone with her worries. And he thinks again about Gianfranco Jr. and how there isn't anything he wouldn't do to see him. Gianfranco Jr. was still playing peekaboo when Giorgio last seen him, so he doesn't ken anything about bairns Ava's age. Her furry hood's up and she's wearing salopettes and mittens. "Are you all right?" he whispers. "Are you warm enough?" "Aye, thank you." Outside, a bottle smashes. A drunk man sings the sash, adding "fuck the Pope" whenever he can't mind what line he's on. "Are you wanting to talk?" says Giorgio. Ava sits up in her sleeping bag, puts her chin on her knees. She says, "It's like we're in a fairy tale." "Is it?" And Ava's like, "Aye, stories always get worse before they get better. You've just got to wait for the ending." "Here," says Giorgio, no sure if his idea's going to seem patronising. "You wanting a story afore bed?" "OK." But Giorgio can't mind any stories, so he just makes up some mad shite based on the stuff Marjorie's been havering all day. He's like, "Have you ever been to London?" Ava isn't sure. "I ken you'll have seen it on the telly. It's where the Queen lives in a big palace with all the princesses and princes, and there's all sorts of baddies that live in a big house with a massive clock, and they've got vast treasures, diamonds and jewels, geese that lay golden eggs, wheels that spin money for nothing." Then Giorgio explains how everybody kens that in the middle of London there's a bunker below the Ministry of Defence. She can look this up when the internet's back on, he says. And a few people even ken that it's connected to other bunkers under other important buildings. But what nobody kens, cause it's a secret, is about the Ark. "See," says Giorgio, "when something goes wrong, a wee bit like what's happening the now. All the sodgers in London, fae the SAS to all the numpties on horse with the big funny hats, have to build walls round the green zone. The zone's on the bank of the Thames, where you see the pictures of the big wheel and the clock and all that. When all the bigwigs are inside, they blow up Westminster Bridge, bang, and they shoot anybody that gets too close. They've got cellars full of food, fuel, water, emergency oxygen, medical supplies, all the stuff folk up here didn't have. Because here's another secret," says Giorgio. "They're going to turn Scotland into a theme park, and they're going to call it Disneyland. They're going to call it Disneyland," he says, "because it doesn't vote for them, it doesn't like them, and it doesn't effing matter." He pauses, waiting to see if Ava will laugh. But Ava's already asleep, her breath heavy, her wee legs twitching in her sleeping bag.
The sense of fear and threat from outside is palpable. From the cold, the smashing bottle, the sectarian singing. However, what Disneyland does is turn the traditional structure of the apocalyptic or social collapse novel on its head. Rather than showing how society descends into dystopia and people start turning on each other, Disneyland starts with our current dystopian society and imagines how ordinary people pull themselves out of it.
So that, like, overwhelmingly, books, films, I mean, our culture's obsessed with the end of the world. We're prophecising it constantly, although we're maybe not yet doing masses to avert it. But almost always, something goes wrong, and fairly quickly, folk turn into a sort of state of savagery. And it's sort of the war of all against all. Basically, the telly goes off one day, and the next day you try and eat your neighbour. Curiously, the protagonists of these novels, they almost always stay sort of pretty good and decent, while everyone goes crazy all around them. And I think we all imagine, every person imagines that, in a disaster scenario, I'd not be the one going around trying to kill other people. I'd be all right. It's a wee bit like, they do surveys and they say, like, do you think you're a better than average driver? And something like 95% of people think they're better than average drivers. And same way people think. But they're very afraid of other people. And in fact, even beyond the post-apocalyptic genre, I think that an awful lot of our literature is devoted to the idea that there's something quite frightening inside us. Like, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, something like that. It's this, or the Lord of the Flies. The beast is inside us all. And yet, actually, you look at real-world examples of disaster, and that sort of prophecy of it being an outlet for human barbarism doesn't really seem to be the case at all.
Funnily enough, in the 1960s, there was actually a real-life Lord of the Flies situation when 6 boys, aged 13 to 16, found themselves stranded on an island in the Pacific Ocean for 15 months. But while the kids in Lord of the Flies soon regressed into barbarism and turned on each other due to the absence of a powerful authority figure, these real-life children worked together to survive on the island, sharing cooking and guard duties, building shelter and maintaining a communal garden, all in stark contrast to the assumptions around human nature contained in Golding's novel.
Well, there's a good book, Rebecca Solnit, she wrote a book, Paradise Built in Hell, that looks at, it's mainly American stuff, but it looks at a few examples, and I think the last one is Hurricane Katrina. If you remember that when I was going on, there was all these media stories about there were gangs and there were looting and pillaging and murdering and all of this. And in fact, that was just partly driven by racism, but also driven by our collective beliefs about how people will behave in a time of crisis. And the reality was totally different. In fact, people were doing practicing sort of mutual aid and trying to help each other out.
Indeed, in her book, Solnit stresses the difference between working class responses to disasters from those of the state. For instance, during the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, while local residents were self-organising search, rescue and firefighting efforts, the government sent in the army, who killed between 50 and 500 survivors. Solnit's work builds on the groundbreaking research of Charles Fritz, which showed that in disaster situations, most rescue and relief efforts are undertaken by the survivors themselves. And while the media often talks about looting, in fact, rates of theft and burglary actually decline during disasters, and far more goods are given away than are stolen. This spontaneous, self-organised meeting of human needs without money, markets, and often in opposition to capitalists and the state is sometimes referred to as disaster communism, referring to communism from below rather than the ideology of a party governing a dictatorial state. Similar tendencies could also be seen during the COVID-19 pandemic.
I think like the COVID, the first lockdown, and I think that we always got to remember what that first lockdown was like, because we had so many others that were sort of a wee bit partial and, but that first one, it was really frightening. And, I can remind you'd be, if you went out for a jog and you realised you'd been for a walk that morning, you were terrified you were going to get lifted or someone was going to, it really was a bizarre sort of scenario. And we were all outside on the street on a Thursday night. And there's a degree of sort of, you can be sceptical about all that for many reasons, but everyone out there singing together and going round to your neighbours and people checking, putting things through your door. Do you need any help getting your messages and what have you? And even just at that very, very basic everyday life level, when something goes a wee bit long, right? You're stuck on a train. You know, there's a bad rail problem, right? And you're on a busy carriage and you've been held there for 2 hours, and you see how long it takes for people to start talking. And they'll start saying, I was really hoping to get Birmingham by such and such time. I'm meeting my sister. And if I'd have known this, I didn't pack any water. And then see how long it takes someone to say, I've got some water. Do you want some? And people will start talking and they'll start sharing. My interest is in the wee things that people do, the improvised solutions, the silly things. And I hope that's in the novels. I maybe even try to make a claim that there's something that you can find in a lot of, you know, you look at really great writers. I think that you find that pathetic juxtaposition a lot. I'd say that Tolstoy, for instance, like in War and Peace, he's looking at enormous sort of changes of a global significance. But when he looks at how battles are decided and things like that, it's like the unplanned daft actions of individuals, you know, that are sort of caught in a crowd and all this that really shape things. Or like James Joyce, you know, his great study of everyday life in Ulysses is also like, he takes the Homer's Odyssey, takes this epic form to structure it all around. And it's about a guy going to the shops and having a dump and all the rest of it. I suspect there's something important there about understanding how society works and how it can be changed. Like, our lives are epic to us, you know? And I suppose that's one of the, maybe that's the novel's sort of great achievement, is to take ordinary lives and show them on an epic scale, because for us, each of us, there's nothing grander than our own life and struggle.
That's all we've got time for in this episode. Join us in part 2, where we'll have more readings from Disneyland, and we'll discuss the novel's use of Scots language and dialect and its utopian vision for social change. We also have some bonus content exclusively for Patreon supporters, the first which goes into more detail about the history of McDonald's workers' resistance, and the second in which we discuss more aspects of Darren's writing that we weren't able to fit into the main episodes. It's only support from you, our listeners, which allows us to make these podcasts. So if you appreciate our work, please do think about joining us on patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. In return for your support, you get early access to content, as well as exclusive bonus content, discounted merch, and much more. And if you can't spare the cash, absolutely no problem. Please just tell your friends about this podcast and give us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. If you'd like to read some of Darren's novels, check out the webpage for this episode, where you'll find links to buy them from an independent bookshop. You'll also find a link to his website, ddjohnston.uk, as well as sources, further reading, and more. Link in the show notes. Thanks again to our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. Special thanks to Stone Lawson and Jazz Hands. Our theme tune is Bella Ciao. Thanks for permission to use it from Dischi del Sole. You can buy it or stream it on the links in the show notes. This episode was edited by Jesse French. Anyway, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and thanks for listening.